Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
We can offer allegiance to things. We can offer allegiance to our country. We can offer allegiance to our flag. That doesn't bleed over to our religious commitments. So we can have allegiances in different arenas of our life. But the moment somebody's asking us to have an allegiance religiously to anything other than worship of the one true God, now we're in a different scenario altogether. We must obey political rulers until they ask us to disobey God.
Today we will witness one of Scripture's most powerful examples of unwavering faith as three young Hebrew men, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, stand before a blazing furnace rather than bowing down to earthly king's command. Their courage reminds us that God doesn't always keep us from the fire, but He faithfully walks with us through it. Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Daniel as he continues his message, Burning to Shine His Glory.
Either this book or the book of Luke, I think I've taught through the most. And it's just so interesting how you can receive something different from the Lord every single time you come to the Word. Let me give you the recap, and I'm going to do this a little bit throughout chapter 1 through 6 because I really believe it's important. Because as we're going through, I'm really heavily leaning on the aspect of personal application. But I don't want you to forget that the first 6 chapters of this book are chronological. The second 6 chapters are fill in the blank. They go back in time and fill in more stories. But these first 6 chapters that are chronological, they tell us things about the end time. The first half of the book, chapter 1 through 6, takes us through a prototype, a foreshadowing of the end times. And so we came through chapter 1, in which we saw Daniel and his friends being taken to Babylon. And they're a great picture of a believer living in an unbelieving world. And that's the condition, hopefully, of all of us. We're navigating through an unbelieving world as believers. That was chapter 1. And they had to make a stand of faith, a commitment of faith. Chapter 2, then, that we just came through last time, was the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had, in which he saw all the world ruling empires. And that really is easy to apply to the end time scenario, because at the end of that statue, do you remember the stone came that represented the kingdom of God, came in the very end and took out all of those world ruling empires at the feet, at the very end. We talked a lot about the revived Roman Empire to come and some of those things. Well, chapter 3 is the easiest one of all of them for us to understand how this applies to the end time scenario. In all 12 chapters of this book, there's somebody in the 12 chapters. Oh, you know what? Oh, gee, it's named after him. Daniel is in every single chapter of this book except for chapter 3. And we're going to, the account tonight is going to focus on what happened to his 3 friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. And Daniel's not there. He's mysteriously not there with no explanation on top of it, which really adds to that picture that tonight's chapter of the 3 men going through the fiery furnace with Daniel not there is just a wonderful picture of the rapture of the church for Daniel, and then the Israelites going through the 7-year tribulation in the end. And then the next couple of times we get together, we'll see in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is bound and he's kicked out of his throne for a period of time. And that is a great prototype of Satan in the end, being bound for 1,000 years before being loosed at the end of that. Chapter 5, then, we get into the last king of Babylon, Belshazzar, actually. He draws all the lords to himself for one last battle before he's overthrown, which perfectly prototypes exactly what's going to happen at the end of the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ, right? Do you remember reading that in Revelation chapter 20, how Gog and Magog will draw everybody to battle in the end, and yet Christ will come and do away with all of them. And then finally, chapter 6 here in Daniel, it's a prototype of, this is when the Medo-Persians take over, and the distinctive with them is that their laws change not. And they are as close to an earthly prototype as you can get of the everlasting state, in which The laws will not change at all. And so we'll get to those things coming up here in the next couple of weeks that we're together, Lord willing, unless he wants to prototype the rapture and then really do the rapture right now. And that'd be okay too. Then we can learn this from the balcony when we get up there. So that would be okay too. But here in chapter 3 of Daniel, it gives us really a classic example of living by a genuine faith. Genuine? You can only say that if you're in New Orleans, maybe? Okay. Genuine faith is what we're going to see tonight. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 reminds us that without faith, it's impossible to please God. But to exercise faith, we need to be put in situations that we can't just answer immediately. Does that make sense? You ever thought about that? If the Lord wants you to exercise faith, and it's impossible to please him without that, we're going to have to go through situations that we're like, I don't know how to handle that one. We have to. It's an absolute prerequisite. And so this chapter with these three guys faced with this difficulty and not knowing exactly how to get out of it, it's very fascinating. That's what we're going to see is this example of their faith. And the neat thing is God promises in that same verse in Hebrews that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him by faith. And so we're going to look at some actions of three distinct groups of people in this chapter. I want to tear it apart that way and look at the three different distinct groups of people and how they face this challenge or their part in this challenge of true faith. So as we begin chapter 3, we'll start off with the first group of people I want to look at. So verse 1 through 7 is maybe a part of this chapter that maybe if you've read this 1,000 times, maybe you've never thought about them. It's the cowering crowd, the coerced crowd. We're going to see the cowering of the coerced crowd in these first 7 verses. I tell you that the majority of people end up falling in that category. We're reading this chapter because these three stood out as different. Have you ever thought about that? That if everybody did what they did, it would be called like a revolution or rebellion. It wouldn't be their faith. Everybody else was cowering in the corner. So take a look at this. Start in chapter 3, verse 1. It says, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits. And of course, you generally translate that to 90 feet. And in width, it was 6 cubits, or that is 9 feet tall. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. In fact, it's interesting that in 1854, excavations did actually find a pedestal that most scholars would believe makes perfect sense for the size of it, that would be for a statue of this size. So very interesting that it seems that the pedestal for this has actually been found. Now, what's interesting to open this up, even with just verse 1 and him making this statue, if you were with us the last time we were together in chapter 2, that was just, for Nebuchadnezzar, that was just a very short time before he makes this statue of all gold. But you remember what happened in chapter 2, right? He had a dream, and the statue was what? A gold head, silver arms and belly, and so on down of less precious metals. And Daniel gave him the interpretation that the gold head was him, and that there would be succeeding nations after him. Well, he didn't like that idea when he made this statue. And so this seems to be a direct slap in the face of what God did for him and explaining that dream to him through Daniel in chapter 2. And so he says, oh, I'm just a gold head, huh? Oh, there's going to be a nation after me, huh? I'm going to make a statue of all gold, representing that he thinks it's going to be him forever. Well, I noticed that he didn't make, with this statue, he didn't put like a stone cut without hands at the bottom of it, did he? Because he didn't like that part either from chapter 2. And so this being completely gold, I believe, really symbolizes that he is still in rebellion to the God of gods, the King of kings. You might remember in chapter 2, he gave homage, he gave respect to Daniel and the God of Daniel for being able to interpret these things. But he's right back to his old ways. Nothing stuck personally. Now we're going to hold on to that thought. We're going to talk about that extensively in chapter 4. Next time we're together, Lord willing, we'll get to that heavily in chapter 4 about Nebuchadnezzar's condition. You know, do you think he's in heaven? I'll tell you there's a possibility, but we'll look at that next time when we're in chapter 4. So let's keep reading here. In verse 2, then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the counselors and the treasurers and the judges and the magistrates and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then in verse 3, the satraps and the prefect, all of them again, I'm not going to name them again, they were all assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they were standing before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So you get the imagery here of what's happening. So he has called together all of the micro leaders underneath of him from all over. And this, I believe, was specifically intended as a loyalty test. That's what he's doing here. He's wanting them to be marked in his image. Oh yes, I believe this is a specific foreshadowing of the Antichrist requiring a mark in the tribulation. And he's requiring them to come and bow to the image, just like the Antichrist will have them come and bow to an image to be able to buy and sell. Again, what's interesting here, you remember Daniel was promoted in chapter 2 to one of these titles. He was promoted to the title of prefect. And yet here in chapter 3, it says they're all called. And yet there's no discussion of Daniel. He's mysteriously absent and not listed at all. And it's 100% mysterious. And I believe it's that way on purpose. You can't find anything else in the scripture that even alludes to where he was. I think the Lord wanted it that way, because that is a prototype of the rapture itself. It is mysterious. When's it going to happen? Where's he at? What happened? The whole world left behind has no idea what happened. And so it's a prototype of the rapture. And so we continue in verse 4. Then the herald loudly called out, "To you it is said, O peoples, O nations, and men of every tongue, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and" what? Worship. Honor, worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And so as we look at this here, and by the way, it does seem that death by fire seems to be Nebuchadnezzar's death penalty of choice, by the way. I don't know if you know this, but this is also remarked on by Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 29, that Nebuchadnezzar puts people into his fiery furnace. And so these three guys aren't the only ones. I think there's two more, specifically by name listed in Jeremiah 29, that Nebuchadnezzar also did this to. But did you notice that this loyalty test, this is not just a political thing. It isn't, is it? Oh, he's calling all of his rulers, all of his employees, his management. But it's not just a political test. This is a religious test. This is a religious test of loyalty. Bow down and worship this golden image. I think that's important for us to recognize for our application today, right? If somebody's just asking us to show allegiance to a job, hey, sign this statement that you're not going to betray our company's values or something, or sign this statement that you're not going to go work for the competitor. Hey, we can do that. We can do that. This is a religious test. That's a specific thing that they're doing. Now, look, we can offer allegiance to things. We can offer allegiance to our country. We can offer allegiance to our flag. That doesn't bleed over to our religious commitment. So we can have allegiances in different arenas of our life. But the moment somebody's asking us to have an allegiance religiously to anything other than worship of the one true God, now we're in a different scenario altogether. We must obey political rulers until they ask us to disobey God. We can have all the allegiance in the world to our workplaces, to our country, to everything, until they ask us to disobey our God. And then that is the time to stand and say, I cannot do it. I have a higher allegiance. And your boss isn't going to want to hear that in that day. Your president, your governor won't want to hear that in that day. But we all as believers, we are ambassadors of another country, and that is our ultimate allegiance. And so make no mistake about it. This is a religious test that they're being put to. And now verse 7, here's the response of all the crowd. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and men of every tongue fell down, and they worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And so all of these powerful leaders, the movers and the shakers, all the influence makers, all of the important people, Every one of them, they bow down. Have you ever thought about that in this story as you've been reading this account? I mean, we're going to go on and we're going to focus so much on the three, on Daniel's three friends. It didn't. What about everybody else? Every single person just bows and cowers to this religious test. I got to ask you, do you think every single one of these had a religion, had a system of worship in which it was allowable to also worship Nebuchadnezzar? No, I don't think so. Do you see the point? There are people here, whether they were believers in Yahweh or not, that absolutely compromised their core fundamental belief to do this. And it happens all the time. It happens all the time. Well, look at the circumstances. It's beautiful music. It's a great environment. It's a fun time. Why would you be such a stick in the mud? Well, that's not a very modern term. What should we call it? Not a stick in the mud. Why do you got to be such a, what's a modern term for this? A Debbie Downer. That's even older of a term. Sorry, that didn't help anybody, did it? Why do you got to be such a poopy pants? Whatever you want to call it. I'm setting the stage because I really believe this. That there are people around saying, listen, it's just a good time to just do it. Don't be the guy that stands out, right? Think about this. Nearly all of your friends are doing it. Nearly everyone you know is bowing down. Maybe not Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, but nearly everybody is doing this. Your life is literally on the line, by the way. I wonder if we've ever even been in that position of that kind of pressure. Maybe with a small consequence on the line. Overlook something and don't bring it up. Maybe we have been to a certain degree. But this is to actually violate your commitment to the one true God and to violate that trust relationship that we have. But I'm telling you, I bet you it was very, very easy for people to make up excuses. Think about them. I can think of them. Can you think of the excuses that people are already laying out? They're bowing down, they're doing the thing, and they're already saying things like, well, I'm not really worshiping this thing. I'm just going along to get along. Or maybe they do the classic, the Lord knows my heart, Well, the Lord really knows. I'm not really doing this. Excuses for days. Or you could say, I didn't ask for this, but I got to stand up. I didn't ask for this difficulty. I didn't ask for this dissension. I didn't ask for this trouble. I didn't ask to be the troublemaker. I didn't ask to be the center of attention. But it came to me, and I have to stand up. And that's exactly what we see next, right? It begins in verse 8. So let's take, I tell you, these are the times when a believer has the great opportunities to stand for the glory of God. I do believe that we go through 70%, we go through 80% of our lives with pretty much normal circumstances. There's only so many opportunities in life that we get from the Lord where he's like, there you go. What are you going to do about this one? You going to stand? It's not endless. It's not like every day and all the time there's just endless opportunities to make a difference. I think we got to take them. We got to look for them. We got to take them. And the three men, they're ready to do it in verse 8. And that takes us to our next group of people. And that is, we will see the flex of the faithful few. There's a modern term for you right there. I guess finally got a modern term in. The flex, the idea that they're willing to stand up and be accounted for. They're willing to stand up and say, count me. I'm not doing it. And so let's look at the three starting in verse 8. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and brought charges against the Jews. They answered and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. Verse 10, you, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But, in verse 11, but whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the fire of blazing fire, the furnace of blazing fire. In verse 12, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. I changed their names on purpose. I hope you were with me in chapter 1. I think it's a disrespect to these Jewish men who were doing everything they could to retain their Jewish identity, to call them by this foreign Babylonian name. That, by the way, these names even support and recognize worship of Baal and Marduk and other gods of the Babylonians. So I just refuse to use them. Sort of like I refuse to use the wrong gender. I refuse to use their Babylonian names. I'll give you one more while we're on the subject. Thanks for asking. I refuse to call that land Palestine. It's not called Palestine. It's called Israel. And who gave it the name Palestine? Israel's enemies, the Romans, after they kicked the Jews out. They're the ones that renamed it Palestine. There's another one I refuse to use. Encourage you to refuse to use it. See, we're talking about standing tonight, so that fit in perfectly. Well done. All right. Thanks for asking. I'll move on now. I'm going to reread verse 12. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over this administration of the province of Babylon, namely Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. These men, O king, do not pay attention to you. They do not serve your gods and do not worship the golden image which you have set up. I want you to think of something. Here comes this accusation against the three, right? And in the ears of Nebuchadnezzar, it's going to be like, what? What do you mean they don't serve and worship me? But in the ears of Yahweh, these guys come and make an accusation. They refuse to worship you. And God's up there in heaven going, amen. Think about that. The same accusation made to one person is going to infuriate them about you. But maybe that same accusation to God is seen very, very differently. All of a sudden, it's a compliment because of how you're acting. I love that. It doesn't change who they are. One's going to like it and one's not. I want to be on the side of God. I don't want to be on the side of just a king only. So these Chaldeans here, these ancients of the land of Babylon, they seem motivated by jealousy from chapter 2. Again, if you go back, tie these stories together, chapter 2 would have just been a period of months or year before this, and they could not interpret the dream. And I'm sure they were very much upset with Daniel and these three. And so from chapter 2, I'm sure they were continuing to lust for power and to put these Jews down and raise themselves up. And so as for these three men here, notice how they acted. They didn't cop out and worship the image. They didn't do that. But there's another end of that spectrum too that we need to consider. They also didn't publicly protest and make demands either. They didn't. They simply said, well, I can't do that, and then went about their business. They maybe would not have even been known unless somebody turned them in, right? They weren't asking for this trouble. They're just trying to live their life, okay? And look, I don't want to relitigate the whole COVID thing all over again from years ago, but I know good churches that are just like, well, I'm just going to have to keep doing church anyway. Let them do whatever they're going to do. They weren't looking for a fight. They weren't out protesting, but the fight came to them. And that's exactly what's happening to these guys. The fight came to them, and they will stand. They simply obeyed God and with abstention from evil and didn't take it any farther until the trouble came to them, and then they were willing to stand. And now they have to. So verse 13. So then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and wrath, said to bring Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Then these three men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, the three of you, that you are not serving my gods and do not worship the golden image that I've set up? Now, in verse 15, if you're ready, at the time that you hear the sound of all of the music, then you shall fall down and worship the image that I have made. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And look at this at the end of verse 15. And what God is there that can save you out of my hands? That will tell you something about how he acted at the end of chapter 2, giving all kinds of respect to the God of Daniel. And yet right here, he still sees himself as the absolute authority over these men's lives in all matters, including religious matters. Not true. Not true. I do think there's something we should learn, though, from Nebuchadnezzar's approach, his posture. And this happens a lot throughout the scripture from both the evil and the good.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Daniel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check out our website at cchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Daniel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.